At 4:06 in the morning, Ricardo Mendoza stood under the cold white lights of JFK Airport with an empty wallet in one hand and a folded receipt in the other, asking a woman behind the airline service counter for $40. Not $400, not a ticket, not a hotel room, just $40. Enough to buy milk, bread, and something warm for the 7-year-old girl waiting for him at home. His bomber jacket was torn at the cuff. His shoes were clean but old. His face carried the kind of exhaustion that made strangers look away because they were afraid tiredness like that might be contagious. The woman behind the counter looked him up and down, saw the cracked leather, the unshaven jaw, the airline patch nearly rubbed blank on his sleeve, and smiled like she had already decided what kind of man he was. 3 hours later, that same airport would be screaming his name through emergency channels, begging him to help save 220 people trapped above the Atlantic in a storm that had already swallowed both engines. Ricardo did not know that yet. All he knew was the weight of the phone in his pocket and the message he had not answered from his daughter. "Sir," the desk supervisor said, keeping her voice polished enough for nearby passengers to hear and sharp enough for Ricardo to feel it. "This counter is for passengers with active reservations. If you need charity assistance, you'll have to contact social services." Ricardo swallowed. He did not step back. He did not raise his voice. He only placed the folded receipt on the counter, smoothing one corner with his thumb as if neatness could make humiliation smaller. "I'm not asking for charity," he said quietly. "I'm asking if there's an emergency voucher. Anything. I had a job fall through overnight, and I just need enough to get groceries before my daughter wakes up." The supervisor's nameplate read Marlene Shaw. Her uniform was perfect. Her hair was perfect. Even the pen clipped to her jacket sat at the exact same angle as the silver wings above her name. She glanced at the receipt without touching it. "A job fell through," she repeated. Ricardo heard the meaning beneath it. "Men like you always have a story. Men like you always lose something. Men like you always need somebody else to fix it." "It was a charter connection," Ricardo said. "They cancelled after I arrived." Marlene's eyes moved to his jacket again. "A charter connection?" "Yes." "And you came to an international terminal at 4 in the morning with no money, no active flight, and no confirmed employment." The two passengers waiting behind him shifted. One of them gave a small laugh through his nose. Ricardo kept his eyes on the counter. "I came because I was told there would be paperwork here," he said, "and because my daughter needs breakfast." Marlene leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to make it sound private while keeping every word clear. "Then perhaps you should spend more time planning for your child and less time wandering around an airport telling people you had a job." The laugh behind him came again, louder this time. Ricardo's hand tightened around the empty wallet. Inside it was one expired medical parking pass, a picture of his daughter missing one front tooth, and a grocery card with 37 cents left on it. He had counted it twice on the air train. He had counted it once in the men's restroom. He had counted it again before approaching the counter, as if math might grow kinder if a desperate father stared at it long enough. "I understand," he said. But he did not move fast enough for Marlene. "Security can help escort you to the public area if you're confused," she added. That word landed harder than the refusal. Confused. As if hunger had made him unreliable. As if poverty had made him suspicious. As if a man in a worn jacket could not know exactly where he was standing. Ricardo picked up the receipt and folded it once, then again, then slipped it into his jacket pocket. He looked past Marlene through the wide terminal glass, where aircraft tails stood in the blue-black dawn like silent monuments to another life. For 1 second, his eyes followed the wing lights of a departing jet. His face changed. Not much, just a tightening near the mouth, a focus returning to the eyes. Then he lowered his gaze again. "I'm not confused," he said. A young gate assistant, standing a few feet behind Marlene, noticed the faded patch on Ricardo's sleeve. It was barely visible now, half hidden under years of rain, work, grief, and cheap repairs. The assistant squinted at it, then smirked. "What is that supposed to be?" he asked. "Pilot wings?" The man behind Ricardo laughed openly this time. The gate assistant tilted his head and said, "That's the pilot?" The words moved through the little group like a joke they had been waiting for permission to enjoy. Even Marlene's mouth twitched, though she tried to hide it under professionalism. Ricardo heard every sound: the laugh, the breath, the soft click of someone's phone camera turning toward him and then away when the moment seemed too small to record. He did not defend the patch. He did not say that the jacket had once hung in a cockpit over Lisbon, with rain hammering the windshield so hard the glass looked alive. He did not say that he had flown through worse darkness than this terminal could imagine. He did not say that, before medical bills and funeral flowers and late notices, people had trusted his hands with their lives. He only nodded once, as if accepting a weather report, and stepped out of the line. The terminal swallowed him. Rolling suitcases clicked over polished floors. Espresso machines hissed behind closed cafe gates. A cleaning machine hummed near the wall, leaving a wet shine under fluorescent light. Every few yards, screens glowed with departures to Madrid, Rome, Paris, Lisbon. Ricardo walked past them with his daughter's lunchbox hanging from 2 fingers. It was pink, dented on one side, with a sticker of a cartoon moon peeling from the corner. He had carried it because he had planned to stop at a 24-hour market on the way home. Cereal, milk, bananas if they were cheap. Maybe the little cinnamon rolls Sophia liked if there was a sale. His phone vibrated. He stopped beside a row of empty blue seats and took it out. "Daddy, are you coming before school?" The message had 3 purple harps after it. Sophia always used 3. 1 for herself, 1 for him, 1 for her mother. Though she no longer said that part out loud. Ricardo stared at the screen until the letters blurred. He typed, erased, typed again. "Soon, mi cielo." "Did you sleep?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "I tried. There is cereal, but no milk." Ricardo closed his eyes. He could picture the apartment exactly. The small kitchen with 1 cabinet door that never stayed shut. The cereal box folded down and clipped with a clothespin. The thin blanket Sophia dragged from room to room because it still smelled faintly of lavender detergent, the kind her mother used before the hospital turned everything in their lives into paper, numbers, and waiting rooms. On the table, beside Sophia's school folder, there would be the medical envelope he had moved 3 times last night, because every place he put it looked like an accusation. He typed, "I'll bring milk." Then he stared at the words. A promise cost nothing when you sent it. It cost everything when a child believed it. Sophia replied with a smiling face and 3 more hearts. Ricardo pressed the phone against his lips for a moment, then slipped it into his pocket. A man passing by glanced at the lunchbox and then at Ricardo's face. His expression carried quick judgment, then quick discomfort, then nothing. That was how people looked at him lately. Not long enough to help, just long enough to decide. Across the terminal, Marlene was speaking to another employee. Ricardo could still hear pieces of her voice between announcements. "People come in here with stories every day." He said charter. "No active booking, no badge, no authorization." Ricardo kept walking. Near Gate 28, a wall of windows opened toward the runways. Dawn had not fully broken, but the eastern sky had begun to pale behind strips of low cloud. Ricardo stopped there because pilots always stopped near windows, even when they were trying not to be pilots anymore. It was not habit, it was gravity. His eyes moved automatically from tail numbers to taxi patterns, from runway lights to wind direction, from cloud base to the faint smear of weather gathering beyond the horizon. A departure board changed above him. Flight 612, Lisbon connection, boarding delayed. Ricardo's gaze sharpened. 2 crew members stood nearby, one holding a tablet, the other rubbing sleep from his eyes. They spoke quietly, but the terminal was empty enough for fragments to travel. "Dispatch says the Atlantic track shifted again. Cells moving faster than projected. Captain wants to climb above it before the turn." Ricardo turned his head slightly. The crew member with the tablet frowned. "If they're late out of New York, they'll meet the south edge right around the handoff. Should still clear it." Ricardo's thumb brushed the seam of the lunchbox handle. No, he thought. He looked at the clouds again, then at the board, then at a weather display on a staff monitor behind a half-open operations door. He saw only a slice of the radar, not enough for a full read, but enough for memory to wake inside him. A hook-shaped storm edge, a corridor closing faster than dispatch expected, the kind of Atlantic weather that did not look lethal on paper until a flight was already committed and the sky removed every clean option one by one. Lisbon came back to him in a flash, so clear he could smell wet wool and burnt coffee. A cockpit shaking, a first officer whispering numbers too fast, rain crossing the windshield sideways, a warning tone repeating until it became part of the blood. His own hands steady on the controls, while everyone behind him waited for a miracle, and he knew miracles were just procedures performed by someone too stubborn to panic. He stepped closer to the operations door without realizing it. A young airline employee blocked his path. It was the same gate assistant who had mocked the patch. "Sir," he said, his smile already loaded, "this area is restricted." Ricardo blinked, returning to the terminal. "I know. Then why are you standing here?" Ricardo looked past him at the radar slice again. "That storm line is moving faster than your board says." The assistant stared at him. Ricardo immediately regretted speaking. He had learned over the last 2 years that knowledge from a poor man sounded like arrogance to people who had already decided he was useless. "The weather team knows how to read weather," the assistant said. "I'm sure they do." "Then maybe let them do their jobs." Ricardo nodded. "Of course." But he did not leave the window. He watched an aircraft push back, its navigation lights blinking red and green in the dawn. He watched ground crew move beneath it like small figures in a silent film. He watched the clouds beyond the glass, and something old and disciplined inside him began counting. Marlene appeared beside the assistant a minute later. Her expression tightened when she saw Ricardo near the operations door. "Mr. Mendoza," she said, reading his name now from the receipt he must have left behind, or from some temporary paperwork pulled from the charter desk. "We already spoke." Ricardo turned. "Yes, ma'am. You cannot linger around restricted areas after being denied assistance." "I wasn't trying to enter." "You were speaking to my staff about weather routing." Ricardo glanced at the young assistant, who looked pleased to be believed. "I made a comment," Ricardo said. Marlene crossed her arms. "A comment about aircraft routing." "Yes." "And what qualifies you to make that comment?" The question hung in the air. It was the easiest moment in the world to tell the truth. He could have said, "Captain." He could have said, "Lisbon." He could have said, 20 years in cockpits, night landings, wind shear, emergency descent, single-engine approaches, passengers praying behind reinforced doors. He could have said that the patch they laughed at had not been costume or fantasy, but history. Instead, his phone vibrated again. A photo appeared from Sophia, a cereal bowl on the table, dry flakes inside. Beside it, a crayon drawing of a plane flying over blue waves, with a small stick figure in the cockpit, wearing a huge smile. Under it, in crooked letters, she had written, "Daddy flies home." Ricardo's throat closed. Marlene followed his eyes to the phone. Her face softened for half a second, but pride stepped in before compassion could. "Mr. Mendoza," she said, "whatever personal situation you are dealing with, this is not the place to perform expertise you do not have." Ricardo turned the phone screen off and put it away. "You're right," he said. The words cost him less than arguing would have. He had a daughter to feed. He had no room for pride, if pride could not buy milk. Marlene seemed satisfied. "Thank you." Ricardo stepped away from the operations door and returned to the public seating area. He sat at the end of a row where the overhead light flickered every few seconds. He placed Sophia's lunchbox on his knees and folded both hands over it. From where he sat, he could see the departure board. Flight 612 remained delayed. Then the status changed. Boarding. Ricardo leaned forward. A senior flight attendant walked past him with a crew bag rolling behind her. She was in her early 40s, composed, with tired eyes that missed very little. Her name tag read Elena Brooks. She had been near the counter earlier. Ricardo remembered her because she had not laughed. Not when Marlene refused him, not when the assistant mocked his jacket. Elena had simply watched, and sometimes being watched without cruelty felt almost like mercy. As she passed, a small paper slipped from the side pocket of her bag and fell near Ricardo's shoe. He picked it up. "Ma'am," Elena turned. You dropped this. She took it from him. Thank you. For 1 second, her eyes moved to the lunchbox, then to his face, then to the faded patch on his sleeve. She did not ask about it. You okay? She said. Ricardo gave the automatic answer every exhausted parent gives when the truth is too heavy for a stranger. Yes. Elena nodded, but she did not believe him completely. Before she could say more, a crew coordinator called her name from the gate. Elena, they're moving. She looked back toward the jet bridge, then at Ricardo again. Take care of yourself. Ricardo almost smiled. Trying? She walked away, but after a few steps, she turned. Ricardo was not looking at her anymore. He was looking at the departure screen, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a desperate man watching flights he could not afford. It was the expression of someone listening to a room no one else could hear. Elena followed his gaze to the status line. Flight 612, final boarding. Then an announcement came over the terminal speakers, bright and routine. Good morning, passengers on Atlantic Meridian Flight 612 with continuing service toward Lisbon. We are now inviting final boarding groups to proceed through Gate 31. Passengers rose, suitcases rolled, coffee cups lifted. A little boy pressed his forehead against the glass to watch the aircraft. The terminal became motion and noise, ordinary and safe-looking. Ricardo stood slowly. Beyond the windows, the aircraft waited under a sky beginning to bruise purple at the edges. Its lights blinked with steady confidence. Its engines were not yet loud enough to drown the announcements. Its nose pointed toward a route Ricardo could almost see unfolding in his mind. Climb, turn, oceanic handoff, storm edge, narrowing corridor, pressure drop, bad timing. He whispered one word before he could stop himself. Too late. No one heard him except Elena, who had paused at the jet bridge entrance. She turned back. Ricardo looked down at Sophia's lunchbox in his hand. Then he looked through the glass at the aircraft, carrying 220 people toward the Atlantic. For the first time that morning, fear crossed his face. Not fear for himself. That had burned out of him a long time ago. Fear because the sky had just begun making a mistake, and no one inside the airport knew it yet. The aircraft pushed back from Gate 31 as if the morning were ordinary. From inside the terminal, ordinary was exactly how it looked. A tug easing the nose away from the jet bridge, ground crew in reflective vests lifting their hands in practiced signals, the soft blink of wing lights against the blue dawn, passengers settling into seats with coffee cups, neck pillows, phones still glowing with unread messages. Somewhere inside that aircraft, a child was probably pressing a stuffed animal against the window. Somewhere, a businessman was closing his eyes before the safety demonstration. Somewhere, a woman was texting that she would call after landing. 220 people sat inside a silver tube pointed toward the Atlantic, and none of them could see what Ricardo Mendoza saw from behind airport glass. They could not see the storm line tightening. They could not feel the old Lisbon memory waking under his ribs. They could not hear the small voice in his head counting altitude before the plane had even left the ground. Ricardo stood there with Sophia's lunchbox in his hand, watching the jet turn toward the taxiway, and the words he had whispered stayed in his mouth like blood. Too late. Elena Brooks paused at the jet bridge entrance longer than she should have. The last passengers were already disappearing down the corridor, and a gate coordinator was waving her forward, but her eyes kept returning to the man in the torn bomber jacket. She had seen desperate passengers before. She had seen men angry about missed connections, families crying over cancelled flights, drunk executives pretending they were not drunk, frightened teenagers traveling alone. Ricardo did not look like any of them. When the announcement began and the aircraft door was being prepared for closure, he had not looked jealous, bitter, or lost. He had looked like someone watching a child step into traffic while the whole street smiled and waved. Elena had been flying long enough to know the difference between panic and recognition. Panic scattered a person's attention. Recognition narrowed it. Ricardo's attention had narrowed until the entire terminal seemed to vanish around him. "Elena," the coordinator called again. "We need you on board." She nodded and stepped into the jet bridge, but just before the door closed behind her, She looked back one last time. Ricardo was still standing at the window, and his hand had risen unconsciously to the faded patch on his sleeve. Inside the aircraft, the cabin carried the usual morning restlessness. Seatbelts clicked, overhead bins slammed, a baby fussed 3 rows behind business class. Elena moved down the aisle with the calm rhythm that came from years of turning fear into procedure. "Bag under the seat, please." "Thank you." "Sir, that laptop will need to be stowed for takeoff." "Good morning. Welcome aboard." She smiled where she needed to smile, touched a nervous passenger's shoulder, helped an older woman adjust her air vent, and tried not to think about the man at the window. But during the safety demonstration, as another attendant pointed to exits and oxygen masks, Elena glanced toward the forward galley and caught a fragment of the cockpit conversation through the half-open door. Nothing dramatic, nothing passengers would notice. A mention of weather deviation, a note from dispatch, a short exchange about the Atlantic track shifting sooner than expected. Then the captain's voice, professional and almost bored, saying they would climb above the roughest layer before oceanic handoff. Elena had heard that kind of confidence 1,000 times. It was supposed to comfort her. This time it did not. Back in the terminal, Ricardo had moved away from the window only because a security officer had begun watching him. He sat again beneath the flickering light with Sophia's lunchbox on his knees and his phone in his palm. He opened the photo she had sent. The cereal bowl, the dry flakes, the crayon plane over blue waves. Daddy flies home. His thumb hovered over the picture, and for one strange second, the drawn plane looked more honest than the real one, taxiing beyond the glass. Children drew planes as if they belonged to the sky by magic. Adults knew better. Adults knew every flight was a temporary agreement between metal, weather, mathematics, and trust. Ricardo had once trusted all 4. Then he had trusted doctors, then invoices, then promises from charter companies that paid late or not at all. The world had taken so much from him that he had trained himself not to reach for what used to be his. But the sky did not care whether a man was broke. The sky did not care whether his license was active in someone's system or buried under debt and grief. The sky only cared if someone understood what it was about to do. Marlene Shaw passed the seating area with a tablet in one hand and the young gate assistant beside her. She noticed Ricardo still there and stopped. Her patience had the brittle shine of someone who believed kindness was a liability. "Mr. Mendoza," she said. Ricardo looked up. "I thought we were clear." "We were," he said. "Then why are you still here?" "Because I'm waiting for a ride." It was almost true. He was waiting for enough courage to leave the building without milk. Marlene's eyes moved to the lunchbox, and then away, as if acknowledging it might force her to become human. "This terminal is for active passengers and employees." Ricardo nodded. "I'll move." He stood, but as he did, an operations monitor behind Marlene flashed a weather update. He saw only a corner of it, red and amber cells curling like a fist, the track line bending too close to the south edge, a timestamp that made his stomach go cold. Ricardo's body reacted before his pride could stop it. "That's not holding," he said. Marlene froze. "Excuse me?" Ricardo looked at the monitor, then at her. "That cell is accelerating east. If Flight 612 stays on that climb plan, they won't be above it before the handoff." The gate assistant gave a short laugh. "Here we go again." Marlene's mouth flattened. "You are not a dispatcher." Ricardo kept his voice low. "No, you are not part of flight operations." "No? Then stop pretending to understand things that trained people are already handling." Ricardo looked past her at the monitor once more. The storm shape reminded him so sharply of Lisbon that he could almost hear the windshield wipers failing to keep up. "Tell them to request a wider deviation now," he said. "Not after 30,000. Now." Marlene stared at him as if he had reached across the counter and insulted her personally. "Do you understand how inappropriate this is?" "Yes. A man who just asked my desk for $40 is now giving operational instructions on an international departure." The gate assistant looked around, enjoying the performance. "Maybe he wants to fly it himself." Another employee nearby smirked. Marlene stepped closer, and lowered her voice. "You need to leave before I call security." Ricardo looked at the floor. The old instinct in him, the captain's instinct, wanted to take command. But the father in him, the hungry father with no badge and no authority, knew command without power only looked like madness. "Okay," he said, "I'll leave." Marlene turned away, satisfied. Behind her, the monitor updated again. Flight 612 lifted from the runway at 5:12 a.m. By 5:19, it was climbing through layered cloud, engines steady, cabin lights dimmed, passengers released from the tight silence of takeoff. Elena moved through the aisle, checking seat belts and gathering the first forgotten wrappers. Through a window near row 9, lightning flickered far ahead, not yet close enough to frighten anyone. The captain made a brief announcement in the tone captains used when they wanted rough weather to sound like a spilled drink. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a few bumps as we continue our climb this morning, so we'll keep the seatbelt sign on a little longer than usual." A few passengers groaned softly. Someone joked about needing more coffee. Elena smiled, but her eyes went to the forward galley. The aircraft dipped once. Not badly, just enough for the service carts to rattle in their latches. Then it rose again, steadying. Normal, she told herself. This was normal. But Ricardo's face would not leave her mind. At 5:38, the first real jolt hit. It did not feel like turbulence at first. Turbulence rolled, shoved, shook. This felt like the aircraft had stepped down onto a stair that was not there. A hard drop, a collective gasp, a plastic cup jumping from a tray table and bursting open against the aisle carpet. The seatbelt sign chimed again, though it had never been turned off. Elena gripped the top of a seat and looked toward the front. The interphone rang. She answered from the forward galley. "Elena," the first officer's voice came through tighter than before. "Cabin secure?" "Cabin secure. Keep everyone seated. We're deviating around weather." "Understood." She waited for more, but the line clicked off. In the cockpit, voices became clipped. On the radar, the storm was not where it was supposed to be. The edge had thickened and moved with a speed that made the earlier dispatch projection useless. The captain requested a heading change, then another. Air traffic control answered with delays and traffic conflicts. The aircraft climbed, but not cleanly. The weather climbed with them, or seemed to. Lightning flashed close enough now to turn passenger faces white-blue for half a second at a time. At JFK, Ricardo had reached the public exit doors when the first emergency murmur moved through operations. It was not an alarm. Not yet. It was a change in posture. Employees who had been bored stood straighter. Someone walked quickly with a headset pressed to one ear. Marlene stopped mid-sentence near the service counter and turned toward the operations room. Ricardo saw it all, reflected in the glass doors in front of him. He should have kept walking. He had no money. His daughter was waiting. Every minute inside that airport made him feel smaller. But the old count in his head had reached the place where theory became consequence. He turned back. No one noticed him at first. That was the gift of being dismissed. He moved toward the edge of the operations area and heard a dispatcher say, "Flight 612 is requesting immediate weather deviation. They're reporting severe chop and possible electrical disturbance." Another voice said, "They were supposed to clear that line." Ricardo closed his eyes. He hated being right. There were men who enjoyed saying, "I told you so." Ricardo had never trusted those men. In the sky, being right too late was just another form of failure. Marlene saw him near the door, and her face hardened. "Security," she called sharply. Ricardo raised one hand, not in surrender but in urgency. "Listen to me for 10 seconds. No. They need to descend before the next cell wall, not climb." The room went quieter, not because they respected him, but because the statement was specific enough to interrupt the rhythm of authority. A dispatcher turned halfway. "Who is that?" Marlene answered before Ricardo could. "No one." The word landed in the operations room with clean cruelty. No one. Ricardo absorbed it without blinking. "If they keep trying to climb over it," he said, They'll hit the shear layer at the worst angle. The young gate assistant muttered, "He's making words up now." Ricardo ignored him. "Ask the cockpit if their left engine temperature is fluctuating." A dispatcher frowned despite himself. "Why would you say that?" "Because if they took that southern edge at climb thrust, the intake turbulence would hit left first." Marlene stepped between him and the room. "Enough." But before she could say more, one of the radios crackled. The words came distorted, buried under static, but clear enough to change every face in the room. "Ops, 612 reporting left engine vibration and temperature fluctuation, requesting priority vector." The dispatcher looked at Ricardo. Marlene did too. For the first time that morning, her expression contained something other than judgment. Ricardo did not enjoy the silence. He used it. "Tell them not to chase altitude," he said. "Have them stabilize attitude, reduce stress on the left side, and get out of the vertical fight. That storm is building faster than they can climb." The dispatcher stared at him for one more second, then looked toward a senior operations manager. The manager was older, grey at the temples, with the practiced suspicion of a man who had seen many confident idiots. "And you are?" he asked. Ricardo opened his mouth, but Marlene cut in again, almost desperate now to restore the world she understood. "He was asking passengers for money at my counter 20 minutes ago." The gate assistant added, "He claimed he had some charter job, no badge, no authorization." The operations manager's eyes moved over Ricardo's worn jacket, the lunchbox, the old shoes. His doubt was quieter than Marlene's, but it was still doubt. "Sir," he said, "this is an active operational situation." Ricardo nodded. "I know. Well then, unless you have current credentials with this airline, you need to step back." Ricardo's jaw tightened. Current credentials. The phrase found every bruise. Current, as if grief could expire a man. Current, as if a cockpit forgot the hands that once saved it. Current, as if the sky checked paperwork before killing people. Still, he stepped back because 2 security officers had arrived, and because Sophia's lunchbox was in his hand, and because nobody believed a poor man until a rich system was out of options. Over the Atlantic, Flight 612 entered the storm's first wall. The aircraft dropped hard enough for screams to rise from the cabin. Oxygen masks did not fall, but several passengers looked up as if expecting them. Elena braced herself in the forward galley, while a coffee pot shattered behind her. The interphone rang again. She snatched it up. "Cabin is seated. Minor injuries possible. What do you need?" This time the captain answered. His voice had lost its smooth announcement tone. "We have engine instability and unreliable data spikes. Keep the cabin locked down." A warning tone sounded behind him. Then another voice, the first officer, lower but audible. "Left engine rollback." Elena's blood went cold. "Captain?" The line clicked. She stood there holding the dead receiver while lightning flashed outside the small galley window. For the first time in many years, she thought of the passengers not as passengers, but as names she did not know yet. 220 lives, each with someone waiting on the ground. Then she thought of Ricardo at the window, whispering, "Too late." At JFK, Ricardo was being escorted toward the public concourse when Elena's voice came through a cabin operations channel routed into the room. She was not speaking to him, of course. She had no idea he could hear, but her voice entered the operations space with professional control stretched thin over fear. "Forward cabin secure. Passengers frightened. We need better information." A dispatcher answered her. "Flight deck is working through engine instability." "Engine instability?" Elena repeated. Then a pause. There was a man at gate 31 before departure. Worn bomber jacket. Latino, late 30s. He said the storm line was moving too fast. Everyone in the room looked toward Ricardo. Marlene went pale. Elena continued. "He also said something about not climbing into it. I don't know who he is, but he knew before we did." The operations manager lifted a hand, telling security to stop. Ricardo stopped walking. The room was quiet except for radio static and distant terminal announcements that now sounded obscene in their cheerfulness. The manager looked at Ricardo. Name. Ricardo Mendoza. Spell it. Ricardo did. A dispatcher began typing. Marlene watched the screen as if hoping nothing would appear. For several seconds, nothing did. Then the dispatcher changed databases, searched aviation licensing, old incident archives, charter networks, emergency reports. One result appeared, then another. Then the dispatcher leaned closer to the monitor. "Sir," he said to the operations manager, "you need to see this." Ricardo looked down at Sophia's lunchbox. He did not need to see the screen to know what they had found. There are some parts of a man's life that stay buried only until the world needs them again. The operations manager stepped behind the dispatcher. His eyes moved quickly across the record. "Ricardo Antonio Mendoza," he read. "Former captain, Atlantic Meridian Regional Contract, Iberian Charter, Emergency Certification, Weather Diversion Training." He stopped. The room waited. The dispatcher clicked another file. A grainy article opened beside an incident report. "Lisbon storm incident," he said softly. 14 years ago. Instrument failure on approach. Severe crosswind. Captain Mendoza landed with partial hydraulics after 2 missed approaches. The young gate assistant's smile disappeared. Marlene's hands lowered to her sides. The operations manager turned slowly. "That was you?" Ricardo did not answer at first. In his mind, Lisbon was not an article. It was rain and metal, and the sound a first officer made when he thought he was about to die. It was passengers clapping afterward, while Ricardo sat alone in the cockpit, unable to unclench his hands. It was his wife, still alive then, meeting him outside arrivals with baby Sophia asleep against her shoulder. He looked up. Yes. The dispatcher's screen flashed with another update. Flight 612 reporting right engine surge. Then, almost immediately, a second transmission broke through. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, Atlantic Meridian 612. We have dual engine flameout indications. Attempting restart. Severe weather. 220 souls on board." No one moved. Dual engine flameout turned the operations room into a vacuum. The phrase removed status, pride, procedure, and every small judgment that had seemed important minutes earlier. Marlene's perfect posture collapsed by an inch. The gate assistant took one step back. The dispatcher gripped the edge of the desk. Even the operations manager, who had spent decades hearing bad news in controlled rooms, looked suddenly older. Ricardo closed his eyes for one breath. Not to pray, not yet. To build the cockpit in his mind. Airspeed, altitude, attitude, storm drift, restart window, passenger weight, glide reality, human fear. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer the man asking for $40. He was not less tired, not less poor, not less worried for his daughter. But something inside him aligned with such quiet force that everyone in the room felt it. "Get me their altitude, heading, airspeed and engine status," he said. Nobody questioned the tone. The operations manager pointed to the nearest headset. "Give it to him." Marlene looked at the headset, then at Ricardo, as if the object itself had become impossible. The dispatcher pulled it free and handed it across the console. Ricardo placed Sophia's lunchbox gently on the floor beside his foot, then reached into his jacket pocket and took out the folded receipt. The crayon photo from Sophia was still open on his phone. "Daddy flies home." He set the phone near the radio where he could see the drawing. The little plane over blue waves trembled as another transmission burst through the speakers. "Flight 612 losing altitude. Restart unsuccessful. Request immediate guidance." The operations manager looked at Ricardo. Elena's voice came faintly from the cabin channel, trying to keep 220 terrified people calm above the Atlantic. Ricardo put on the headset. His hands were steady. His voice, when he spoke, was low enough that the room leaned toward it. "Atlantic Meridian 612, this is Ricardo Mendoza at JFK Operations. I need you to listen carefully. Stop fighting the storm. Fly the airplane first." For half a second after Ricardo spoke, the operations room at JFK seemed to forget how to breathe. The headset sat against his worn hair. The torn cuff of his bomber jacket brushed the console. His daughter's lunchbox rested beside his foot, pink and dented and impossibly small beneath the glow of emergency screens. On one monitor, Flight 612 was only a moving mark over dark water. On another, weather bloomed in red and amber, like a wound across the Atlantic. The people who had dismissed him now stood around him in silence, waiting for the man they had called no one to tell a dying aircraft how to live. Ricardo did not look at them. He looked at the numbers coming through the dispatcher's hand, listened to the broken radio, and built the cockpit in his mind until the walls of the operations room disappeared. He could feel the aircraft shaking. He could see the captain's hands, the first officer's fear, the instruments stuttering under lightning and stress. He could hear the passengers behind the locked door, 220 souls realizing at different speeds that the sky had stopped feeling safe. Atlantic Meridian 612, Ricardo said again, calm and firm. Confirm altitude. The answer came through static. We're passing 21,000, descending uncontrolled through weather. Both engines showing flame out. Restart attempts unsuccessful. Airspeed unstable. Ricardo's eyes moved to the radar. Stop chasing the restart for 5 seconds. I need pitch and airspeed stabilized first. A different voice came through now, strained but listening. The captain. We're losing altitude. I know, Ricardo said. But if you keep pulling against the drop, you'll bleed what speed you have left. Nose down 2 degrees, wings level, let her fly. The operations manager looked at the dispatcher. The dispatcher looked at the screen. Nobody interrupted. Even Marlene Shaw, standing near the doorway with one hand over her mouth, did not move. Every rule she believed in had carried her to this moment, and now none of those rules could reach the aircraft. The man she had nearly thrown out was the only voice steady enough to cross the ocean. In the cabin of Flight 612, Elena Brooks braced herself between 2 jump seats as the aircraft bucked hard enough to throw a purse from an overhead bin. Passengers screamed. A man in row 12 shouted for someone to tell them what was happening. A child cried so violently that the sound cut through the engine silence like a siren. That silence was what terrified Elena most. People thought an aircraft was loud because of the cabin, the vents, the movement of bodies. But flight attendants knew the deep engine sound under everything, the constant promise beneath the floor. Now that promise had vanished. Only wind remained. Wind and rattling panels and the sharp bell of alerts from somewhere behind the cockpit door. Elena forced herself upright and pressed the interphone. Cabin is secure, she said, though it was only half true. We need instructions. There was a pause, and then she heard a voice she did not expect. Not the captain, not the first officer, the quiet man from the window. Elena, Ricardo said through the relay, keep them seated low, heads back, loose items secured. No one stands, no one moves toward the front. You are going to hear changes in pitch. That does not mean we are falling, it means we are flying. Elena closed her eyes for one heartbeat. Then she opened them and stood taller. Understood. She turned to the cabin, her voice rising above the panic. Everyone, listen to me. Seat belts tight, heads back. Hold the person beside you if they need help. We are not giving fear the aisle. At JFK, Ricardo's hand hovered near the radio controls, but did not touch what he did not need to touch. He asked for altitude again, then heading, then wind. Each answer came rougher than the last. Flight 612 was being shoved through layers of air that did not agree with each other, and every instinct in the cockpit wanted to fight. Ricardo knew that instinct. A pilot's body hated surrendering altitude. The hands wanted to pull, to save height, to command the machine back to the line drawn in training. But sometimes the sky punished pride faster than fear. Captain, Ricardo said, you are not dropping out of control if you keep the nose where I tell you. You are trading altitude for airflow. That is the only currency you have right now. The captain breathed hard over the channel. We have passengers screaming back there. Then fly for them, not for the numbers you wanted. A burst of static swallowed the next transmission. The dispatcher adjusted the signal. Ricardo waited, eyes fixed on the storm image. On the console beside him, Sophia's crayon airplane glowed on his phone screen. Daddy flies home. The words were crooked and bright. He did not touch the phone, but he saw it. He let it hold him in the room.
Left engine restart attempt failed, the first officer called.
Right engine, no light off. Stop simultaneous attempts, Ricardo said. One at a time, left first. Give the aircraft clean airflow before ignition. You are inside dirty air. She can't breathe if you keep shaking her apart.
The operations manager whispered to the dispatcher.
Is that right? The dispatcher did not look away from the screen. It's working. Their descent rate is stabilizing. Marlene heard it. Their descent rate is stabilizing. A sentence that should have belonged to a uniformed captain, a senior dispatcher, a person with a badge, a person her world recognized. Instead, it had come from the broke father she had shamed in front of strangers. Her eyes dropped to the floor, where Sophia's lunchbox sat against Ricardo's old shoe. For the first time, she seemed to understand that the object was not pathetic. It was sacred. He had carried that small lunchbox through humiliation because feeding his daughter mattered more to him than being seen correctly. Across the Atlantic, the aircraft lurched again, but this time the movement changed. It was still violent, still frightening, but it had direction now. A body can feel the difference between falling and being guided. Elena felt it before the passengers did. She held the shoulder of an older woman and looked toward the cockpit. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, Ricardo." In row 7, a businessman who had laughed at the delayed boarding gripped both armrests and mouthed a prayer. In row 20, a mother pressed her forehead to her daughter's hair. In the back galley, a young flight attendant cried silently while tightening loose latches, then wiped her face and returned to the aisle because Elena had not stopped moving, and courage often spreads from the person who refuses to sit down. Altitude 18,000, the first officer reported. Airspeed coming back into range. "Good," Ricardo said. "Now hold that. Do not overcorrect when the gust hits. It will hit from your right. Let it pass under the wing."
"How do you know that?" the captain asked.
Ricardo's eyes did not leave the radar hook. "Because I've been inside this storm before." No one in the operations room spoke. The words were not bragging. They were memory. Lisbon moved through his voice like weather through an old scar. For a moment, he was younger, with his wife waiting at arrivals and baby Sophia asleep against her shoulder. He remembered walking out after that landing and trying to smile as people clapped, while his hands shook so hard he had hidden them in his coat pockets. His wife had noticed. She had always noticed. She had taken one of his hands and said, "You came home." That was all she had cared about. Not headlines, not praise. Home. A crackle. Then the first officer shouted, "Left engine light off! We have left engine light off!" The operations room erupted in a sound that almost became a cheer, but Ricardo lifted one hand and cut it off before it was born. "Not yet. Captain, do not surge it. Gentle thrust. Let it stabilize. You still have the storm wall under you." The captain answered faster now. He had stopped hearing Ricardo as a stranger. He was hearing him as command. "Left engine stabilizing. Right still out." "One engine is enough if you respect what she can give you," Ricardo said. "Turn 15 degrees north. Slow. Do not carve. Drift with the edge, then come around the back of it." The operations manager leaned over the map. "That takes them farther from the original track." "Yes," Ricardo said. "The original track is dead." The simplicity of it chilled the room. The original track is dead. That was what authority often failed to say in time. Plans died. Weather changed. Men lost money. Wives died. Children woke up to dry cereal. A life could not be saved by pretending the old route still existed. Ricardo had learned that truth painfully. Now he used it cleanly. Flight 612 turned north. The movement felt endless. Passengers could not see the radar, could not understand the geometry of survival being drawn around them. They only felt the aircraft bank while lightning flashed beyond the windows and the cabin lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Elena kept speaking, not because she had new information, but because a human voice was a rope. "Stay with me. Seatbelts tight. Breathe slowly. Look at me, not the window. We are still here." A man near the front asked, "Who's flying this thing?" Elena looked toward the cockpit door. She thought of Ricardo's torn jacket, the way he had folded his receipt, the way people had laughed when someone said, "That's the pilot." "Someone who knows how to bring people home," she said.
At JFK, the right engine refused to restart. The aircraft had one living engine, damaged systems, and a storm between it and safety. Emergency options began moving across the operations room. Diversion fields, weather windows, fuel calculations, oceanic routes. Every answer had a cost. Ricardo listened to them all and rejected the ones that required the aircraft to become healthier than it was. "No," he said to one suggestion, "too far." To another, "Not in that crosswind." To a third, "They won't have the energy margin." The operations manager did not argue. He only asked, "Then where?" Ricardo stared at the map. A narrow option opened on the edge of weather, ugly but possible. Not the airport anyone wanted, not the clean headline. But runways did not need to be elegant. They needed to be reachable. "There," he said. "Vector them there. Emergency crews ready. Full priority. And tell them to expect a hard landing." The dispatcher relayed the plan. The captain heard it, paused, and said, "That field is tight." Ricardo answered, "So is your life." The line went quiet for a breath. Then the captain said, "Understood." Marlene stepped backward until she touched the wall. The young gate assistant stood beside her, no longer smirking, no longer eager to be seen. His eyes kept moving from Ricardo to the screen, to the lunchbox. Finally, in a voice almost too small to hear, he said, "That's the pilot?" No one laughed this time. The phrase entered the room changed. It no longer carried mockery. It carried disbelief, and beneath disbelief, shame. Marlene looked at him sharply, but he was not joking. He was staring at Ricardo as if the world had rearranged itself in front of him, and he did not know where to place his hands. Ricardo heard the phrase. Of course he did. He had heard it the first time too. But now he had no space for insult, no space for vindication. 220 people were still above cold water, with one engine and a frightened cabin. He leaned toward the microphone. "Captain, when you break through the lower layer, you may see the runway late. Do not dive for it. If you are high, you go around only if the engine gives you permission. If she doesn't, you land long and straight. Better a hard runway than a perfect ocean." "Copy." "Elena," Ricardo said through the cabin relay, "I'm here." "Brace the cabin earlier than normal. Make it simple. Make it strong. No dramatic language." Elena's voice steadied even more. "I can do that." "I know." Those two words reached her in a way she did not expect. "I know." Not "I hope." Not "try." He had seen her now, not as a uniform passing through a terminal, but as a professional holding a cabin together while fear tried to break it open. Elena stood in the aisle, lifted the interphone, and made her voice fill the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Elena Brooks, Senior Flight Attendant. We are preparing for an emergency landing. Listen carefully. Tighten your seatbelts. Remove sharp objects from your pockets. Place your feet flat. When I tell you to brace, you will brace, and you will stay braced until we tell you otherwise. You are not alone in this cabin. We do this together." People cried harder when they heard the words, "emergency landing," but they also obeyed. Fear with instructions became motion. Motion became order. Order became the first fragile shape of hope. The aircraft descended through the final layers of storm. Rain hammered the windows so hard passengers could no longer tell if they were inside weather or underwater. In the cockpit, the runway appeared, vanished, appeared again. The captain cursed under his breath. The first officer called speed, altitude, descent rate. The left engine trembled but held. The right remained dead. The aircraft yawed, heavy and wounded, its nose wanting to drift off the line. Ricardo heard the strain in the captain's breathing. "Small corrections," he said. "Do not wrestle her. She's tired. Guide her." The captain answered with a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. "So am I." Ricardo's eyes flicked to Sophia's drawing. "Then bring her home tired." At 500 feet, the wind shifted. The first officer shouted, "Sink rate!" "Hold," Ricardo said. 400. "Hold." Runway drifting left. Let it drift. Correct. Slow. The operations room watched the data stutter. Marlene closed her eyes. The dispatcher whispered numbers under his breath. The operations manager gripped the back of Ricardo's chair. Somewhere in that airport, people were still ordering coffee, checking bags, complaining about delays. But in that room, the entire world had narrowed to one aircraft, one runway, one voice.
"Brace!" Eleanor commanded. "Brace! Brace! Brace!"
Heads went down. Arms crossed. A little girl screamed for her mother, and her mother answered, "I have you." A man who had never prayed began praying loudly. The young flight attendant in the rear shouted the brace command through tears and did not miss a word.
50, the first officer called.
Ricardo spoke softly now, almost as if he were inside the cockpit with them. Do not pull early.
40.
Let her settle. 30. Now. Gentle. The aircraft hit the runway with a force that seemed to break sound itself. Tires screamed. Metal groaned. Passengers were thrown hard against their belts. Overhead bins burst open. A panel cracked near the rear galley. The left engine roared unevenly, then throttled back. The aircraft bounced once, came down again, and for a terrible second began to drift. The captain fought the rudder. Ricardo's hand closed around nothing. "Straight," he said through clenched teeth. "Keep her straight." The runway rushed beneath them. Emergency vehicles chased from both sides, lights flashing through rain. The aircraft slowed. Not enough. Then more. Then more. The nose shuddered. The cabin filled with sobbing, prayers, the smell of hot brakes. Finally, impossibly, Flight 612 stopped. No one spoke.
In the operations room, the data froze into survival. The dispatcher stared at the screen, waiting for confirmation, because nobody wanted to believe too soon. Static crackled. Then the captain's voice came through, broken and breathless. JFK operations. Atlantic Meridian 612 is stopped on runway. Evacuation not required at this time. We have injuries, but we are down. We are down.
The room exploded. People shouted, cried, clapped, grabbed one another. The dispatcher covered his face with both hands. The operations manager turned away for a second because his eyes had filled before he could stop them. Marlene stood completely still, tears running silently over the makeup she had applied so carefully before dawn. The young gate assistant sat down hard in the nearest chair. Ricardo did not cheer. He removed the headset slowly, as if sudden movement might undo what had happened. Then he picked up his phone. Sophia's drawing was still there. Daddy flies home. He touched the screen once, not to open anything, just to answer it with his hand. The operations manager stepped toward him. "Captain Mendoza." Ricardo shook his head. "Ricardo." The manager stopped, then nodded. "Ricardo, you saved that aircraft." Ricardo looked at the screen, at the mark that no longer moved over water. "They flew it." "But you brought them through." Ricardo did not answer. Praise had always made him uneasy, because praise arrived after danger, when the body was already counting what could have gone wrong. He bent down and picked up Sophia's lunchbox. The small act seemed to break something in Marlene. She walked toward him, but each step looked harder than the last. "Mr. Mendoza," she said. He turned. Her voice failed once. She tried again. "I am sorry." The room quieted. Not completely, but enough. Marlene looked at the lunchbox, then at his jacket, then finally at his face. "I saw your clothes. I saw your wallet. I saw what I expected to see, and I treated you like you were less than a person." She swallowed. "I was wrong." Ricardo held her gaze. Everyone waited, perhaps expecting anger, perhaps hoping for the kind of speech that would make the moment feel complete. But Ricardo had no interest in making humiliation theatrical. He had carried too much real pain to decorate it now. After a moment, he said, "Next time a father asks for help, don't make him prove he deserves to be heard." Marlene's face crumpled. She nodded. "I won't." He believed that she wanted to mean it. That was enough for the moment. He turned toward the exit because the rescue was over and the original emergency remained. Sophia was still home with dry cereal. He still had no milk. The world had just called him captain again, but his daughter was waiting for breakfast. Before he could leave, Elena's voice came through the operations speaker. The cabin channel had been reopened from the landed aircraft. Her voice shook now, because the danger had passed and the body was finally allowed to know it. JFK Operations, this is Elena Brooks from 612. Tell Ricardo Mendoza. She paused. In the background, passengers were crying, laughing, clapping, calling loved ones. Tell him there are 220 people here who want to know his daughter's name.
Ricardo closed his eyes.
The operations manager looked at him.
Sophia, Ricardo said.
The dispatcher leaned toward the microphone.
Her name is Sophia.
There was a delay. Then, from the speaker, a sound rose that Ricardo would remember for the rest of his life. Not a cheer exactly, not applause exactly. It was messier, more human. A wounded cabin full of living people saying his daughter's name. Sophia. 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 Elena came back on the line, crying openly now. They know Ricardo. They know their pilot had someone waiting for him too.
Ricardo covered his mouth with one hand. For the first time that morning, his control broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that the operations room looked away out of respect. He had not cried at the counter. He had not cried when they laughed. He had not cried when both engines died over the Atlantic. But hearing strangers speak his daughter's name from an aircraft that should have been lost opened a door grief had kept locked for years.
Then his phone rang. The name on the screen was Sophia.
Ricardo answered quickly, wiping his face with the heel of his hand. Mi cielo.
Daddy? Her voice was small, sleepy, worried. Why are people on TV saying your name? The room around him changed. Several employees turned toward a monitor near the wall. Local news had already picked up the emergency landing. A headline ran beneath shaky footage of emergency vehicles surrounding the aircraft. Former Captain Ricardo Mendoza assists in saving Atlantic Meridian Flight 612. Former Captain. The words looked strange on the screen, like a coat taken from storage and shaken clean. Ricardo stepped away from the console, lowering his voice the way parents do when the whole world is too loud for a child. You saw that?
Our neighbor came in, Sophia said. She said to look. Daddy, are you in trouble?
He laughed once, but it broke halfway. No, baby. I'm not in trouble.
Were you flying?
He looked at the headset on the console, at the storm map, at Marlene standing with wet eyes, at the young assistant who could not look at him, at the phone with her drawing still open.
Not exactly, he said. I was helping.
Did you help the plane come home? Ricardo pressed his eyes shut. For years he had tried to hide the size of his falls from Sophia. He had hidden bills, hidden hunger, hidden the worst of his grief. He had thought protecting her meant making himself smaller so she would not see how much the world had taken. But children see what silence hides. They see empty refrigerators. They see fathers counting coins. They see sadness folded into jackets.
Yes, he said.
I helped the plane come home. There was a little pause. Then Sophia whispered, like my drawing. Ricardo looked at the crayon plane on his screen. Like your drawing? Are you coming home too? The question was so simple that it almost brought him to his knees. That was all she wanted. Not a hero, not a headline, not a captain. Home. Yes, he said. I'm coming home. With milk? A laugh moved through the room before anyone could stop it. Not mocking this time, gentle, human. Ricardo smiled through tears. With milk, he said, and bananas if they have them, and cinnamon rolls? He looked at the empty wallet in his hand. The old shame reached for him again, but before it could close, Marlene stepped forward. She held something out. Not charity with a performance, not pity, just a plain airport meal voucher, a stack of cash from several employees and his folded receipt. Her hand trembled. Ricardo looked at it. Marlene said quietly, "Please." He could have refused. Pride almost asked him to. But Sophia had asked for cinnamon rolls, and love was stronger than pride. He accepted the money with a nod. Yes, he told his daughter. Cinnamon rolls too. Sophia gasped, like he had promised her the moon. When Ricardo finally walked through the terminal, the airport had changed around him. Or maybe it had not changed at all, and people were only seeing what had been there from the beginning. Employees stepped aside. Passengers who had heard the news turned to look. Someone began clapping near the cafe. Then another person joined. Then another. The sound followed him past the same counter where he had asked for $40 and been made to feel like an inconvenience to the world. The young gate assistant stood there, pale and ashamed. As Ricardo passed, the assistant whispered, "Captain Mendoza." Ricardo paused. The assistant's eyes filled. "I'm sorry." Ricardo studied him for a second. He was young enough to believe cruelty was confidence if the room rewarded it. Ricardo shifted the lunchbox to his other hand. "Learn from it," he said. Then he kept walking. Near the exit, Elena appeared on a video call routed from the landed aircraft. A dispatcher held the screen up for him. Her hair had come loose from its perfect twist. Her face was streaked with tears. Behind her, passengers wrapped in emergency blankets waved, cried, held up phones, held each other. Elena looked exhausted and alive. "Ricardo," she said, "they want to see you."
"I'm not much to see," he said.
Elena smiled. "That's not true." The camera turned. Faces filled the screen, people he would never meet properly. A mother holding her child, an older man with blood on his forehead giving a thumbs up, the businessman from row 7 crying without shame, a young flight attendant pressing both hands over her heart. They began clapping again, but through the tiny speaker it sounded distant, like rain on another roof. Then someone in the cabin shouted, "That's the pilot!" This time the words did not wound him. They rose, bright and rough, and full of recognition. Other passengers repeated it, not as a question anymore, but as an answer. "That's the pilot! That's the pilot!" Ricardo looked down because he did not know where else to put so much grace. Elena brought the camera back to her face. "Go home to Sofia," she said. "We'll tell her the rest someday." Ricardo nodded. "Thank you for holding them together." "We followed your voice." "No," he said. "You gave them yours." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Some kinds of respect are too large for formal language. Then the call ended, and Ricardo stood in the terminal with his daughter's lunchbox, his old jacket, and a name the world had briefly remembered. Outside, dawn had finally broken over JFK. The storm that had owned the morning was far away now, still raging over water, but the light over the airport had turned gold at the edges. Ricardo bought milk from an overpriced airport market, then bread, then bananas, then, because Sofia had asked, and because 220 strangers had spoken her name from a living aircraft, he bought the cinnamon rolls too. The cashier recognized him from the screen behind the counter and tried to refuse his money. Ricardo gently placed the bills down anyway. "Today," he said, "let me pay for my daughter's breakfast." The cashier nodded and bagged everything carefully, as if groceries could be honored. When Ricardo reached his apartment, Sofia was waiting in the hallway in pajamas and mismatched socks. Their neighbor stood behind her, crying into a tissue. Sofia did not run at first. She looked at him as if checking whether the man on television and the father in the hallway were the same person. Ricardo set the grocery bag down and knelt. "Hi, mi cielo." She walked toward him slowly, clutching the crayon drawing to her chest. "They said you saved a plane." "I helped." "They said people were scared." "Yes." "Were you scared?" Ricardo looked at her little face, at the sleep still in her eyes, at the front tooth missing from her smile, at the drawing she had made before she knew it would become the thing that held him steady through the worst minutes of the morning. He could have lied. Fathers often lie to protect the shape of safety. But she was old enough to know when his voice made walls and when it opened doors. "Yes," he said, "I was scared." Sofia stepped closer. "But you came home." Ricardo's breath caught. He remembered his wife saying the same words after Lisbon. Baby Sofia asleep against her shoulder, the world still wet with rain. "You came home." He pulled his daughter into his arms and held her so tightly that the drawing crumpled softly between them. "I promised your mother I always would," he whispered. Sofia wrapped her arms around his neck. "Are you a pilot again?" Ricardo closed his eyes. Behind him, the grocery bag sat open, milk cold against the floor, cinnamon rolls warm in their paper, ordinary miracles waiting to be put on a small kitchen table. He thought of Marlene's apology, Elena's voice, passengers saying Sophia's name, the captain bringing a wounded aircraft down through rain. He thought of the patch on his sleeve and the years he had spent believing a man could lose himself so completely that even the sky would forget him. He pulled back enough to look at his daughter. "I'm your dad," he said. "That comes first." Sophia considered this with the seriousness of a child, deciding whether an answer is big enough. Then she smiled. "But dads can be pilots too." Ricardo laughed softly. "Yes, dads can be pilots too." She took his hand and led him into the apartment. On the table was the cereal bowl from the photo, still waiting. Dry flakes. A spoon. A place set for hope before hope had arrived. Ricardo poured the milk slowly, while Sophia watched like it was a ceremony. Then he opened the cinnamon rolls, placed one on a small plate, and sat across from her as morning filled the kitchen. On the television in the neighbor's apartment, someone was still talking about Flight 612, about the broke single father at JFK, about the former captain who had stepped out of humiliation and into history for 27 impossible minutes. But in Ricardo's kitchen, the volume was low. The story that mattered most was quieter. A girl eating breakfast, a father home, a crayon plane on the table between them, flying over blue waves toward a place where someone was waiting. Sophia picked up the drawing and smoothed the wrinkled paper with both hands. "Daddy," she said, "can we tape it somewhere better?" Ricardo looked at the refrigerator, empty except for an old-school calendar and a magnet shaped like a sunflower. He nodded. Sophia carried the drawing over, stretched onto her toes, and pressed it beneath the magnet. The little plane tilted slightly to the left. The stick figure in the cockpit smiled too widely. The blue waves looked nothing like the Atlantic, and exactly like it. Ricardo stood behind his daughter and rested one hand on her shoulder. Hours earlier, strangers had looked at his torn jacket and seen failure. They had looked at his empty wallet and seen weakness. They had heard him ask for $40 and decided that was the whole measure of the man. But they had not seen the storm he had already survived. They had not seen the promise he kept breathing into every broke morning. They had not seen the little girl who still believed her father could fly home. Now Sophia looked up at him, milk on her upper lip, cinnamon sugar on her fingers, pride shining through her sleepy face. "That's the pilot," she said. Ricardo smiled. And this time, the words did not belong to the airport, or the passengers, or the screens, or the people who had needed proof before they offered respect. They belonged to his daughter, and because they came from her, they were enough.